Hey, I'm back. I'm not sure I'll be able to film every 2 weeks like I was doing for a long time, but at least I'm back for this show and another one coming up. I've been working hard trying to get all of my delayed projects finished, and I found a short gap in time where I can do some filming. My dad is the guy that got me into science fiction and fantasy, because he was a science fiction fan way back in the 40s and 50s. But I've noticed that when I sit down and say, "Hey Dad, what should we watch?" he, often asks for a vampire movie. He loves vampire movies. So I thought I would talk a little bit about vampires here. Now, the book Dracula is arguably the greatest horror novel of all time. In this book, Bram Stoker invented the concepts that vampires don't have reflections or shadows. This is probably a spin-off of the idea that demons or ghosts don't have shadows, and this no reflection idea has entered vampire lore. The no shadow idea has not, probably because we can use camera tricks to avoid reflections, but it's a lot harder to remove shadows. In the British TV series Ultraviolet, which is about vampires, the creatures don't cast reflections, and they can't speak over telephones, they can't be photographed. Basically, they can't use any artificial means to broadcast or record their presence. And this is used to good effect in the show because it means the vampires have to meet you face to face to give orders or make a deal. That's kind of cool in the show. But let's talk about the no reflection thing. Why did this become such a dominant idea? I mean, there's plenty of vampire movies where vampires can't turn into bats, or in which they're not super strong, or other things that vampires are supposed to have. Well, one reason is that having no reflection is pretty cool and leads to some really good reveals and nice scenes. If you remember in Fright Night, Roddy McDowell discovers that Chris Sarandon is a real vampire, like you're seeing here. It's a great disclosure. And then, of course, he's all worried about not letting the guy know. And then we've all seen movies in which the vampire sneaks up behind a woman who's looking into her vanity mirror so she doesn't see the monster. These are really cool moments. Another reason for the no reflection thing is that it extends to photographs and film. And this is very useful because it makes it harder for the heroes to prove that the vampire exists. This is great not only for movies, but for role-playing games, because it forces the heroes to be on their own. The authorities won't or can't help. But let's dig into this. It's not just that vampires have no reflection, their clothes don't reflect either. Now, we could argue that this only counts for the clothing they were buried in, but I mean, surely a vampire can change his clothes. Plus, if a vampire is like a couple centuries old, aren't his old clothes rotted away? He's got to go get new ones, right? So let's skip the question of where the clothing goes when he turns into a bat. That's a whole different thing. So often, a film has some gag where a vampire is holding something that we see floating in a mirror. But how far does this extend? If a vampire is wearing a hat, it's not visible in the mirror. But if he takes off his hat, does the hat become visible? If a vampire pulls out his handkerchief, does the handkerchief become visible? What if the vampire, spits or bleeds or something? If a vampire is dripping with blood, is the blood visible in the mirror? I mean, it's not actually the vampire's blood usually. What if it does other body functions? My natural thought is that anything in close contact with the vampire's body stays invisible. So if you throw paint on the vampire, it might be visible briefly in the mirror, but then very quickly it would become invisible. If it's raining, the raindrops as they hit the vampire vanish in the mirror. You might see kind of a hollow shape through the drops. Now, there's a story called The Night Flyer by Stephen King. Basically, a vampire pees into the urinal. A guy's watching through the washroom mirror, and he sees the pee appear in midstream. Of course, it's black and red because it's, vampire pee. In the story, the man also realizes that if he turns his head and looks at the vampire, he'll see it, but then the vampire will kill him. So he just watches. Now, I don't have a lot of respect for Stephen King, especially during his really bloated 80s decade and recently, but at times he pulled out good images. Night Flyer is kind of a fun vampire movie and generally overlooked. It's a very inhuman vampire, which I like. So, that's the question. Does vampire pee appear in mirrors? Well, here's what I say. If your story or your game or your movie is going to have a single scene with some bizarre use of a vampire's reflection, go ahead and do it, even if it contradicts something you've said before. If you're caught and you have to explain it, say it's a mystery or otherwise lampshade it. When I'm caught in an obvious contradiction by my players in Call of Cthulhu, I often respond by saying wisely, "Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? I wonder why you could hear the vampires howl on the original VHS tape, but not when you tried to record it just now." Then, of course, I listen carefully as the players try to figure it out. They may come up with a good explanation. If they don't, shrug and keep going. The story's fun is more important than the logic. After all, it's not like real life is logical. Maybe the vampires howl echoed, and that's why the VHS tape could record it, because it can get the echo. Who knows, right? The bottom line is everything about a vampire should be unreflected and unphotographed for fun purposes. Don't let the players or viewers get bogged down in what can or can't be reflected. If a mosquito is bitten by a vampire, does the mosquito become unreflected? I mean, sure. Why not? Though if you don't want to worry about something like that, just assume mosquitoes aren't attracted to vampires. We still have questions left. Why don't vampires reflect? Now, there's no natural or physical reason for this. One excuse sometimes given is because mirrors used to have silver backing, and photographic emulsions used to use silver, so it can't appear on silver. This cannot be the correct reason, and here's why. Not logical, but emotional. We don't use silver the same way today, but we still want our vampires to not reflect. So dump this idea. Another possibility is that vampires have no souls. But this doesn't work either. I mean, unless you're an animist like me, furniture don't have souls, but they reflect. Even if you are an animist, things like human shadows reflect. They don't have souls. They're just an optical illusion, you know? I'm not sure if rainbows reflect, but even if they don't, I doubt it's because they're soulless. Just remember, vampires are neither living nor undead. They are undead. They're from a whole different universe. What if mirrors don't reflect vampires because vampires are somehow partly from the mirror universe, or they're manifesting the power of the mirror universe? Now, one of my very favorite books is Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. It's a really weird and scary book. Almost all of the inhabitants of the Looking Glass universe are relentlessly unfriendly and hostile to Alice, and she is constantly endangered. The few entities which seem to want to help her, like the White Knight, have trouble doing so. I love this book, I still do, and there's a general agreement among other movies and things that if you go through a mirror to the other side, it's dangerous. For example, the USA, maybe somewhere else too, has a creepy legend about Bloody Mary, a ghost or a demon that appears in a mirror. There's a movie called Close Encounters of the Spooky Kind from Hong Kong, and in this they talk about something called peel apple, where you have to peel an apple in a mirror, and if you peel the whole apple all the way through, you get a wish or something, and if you break it, then a monster appears in the mirror, a Bloody Mary type thing, and this happens in the movie. There's other American legends and other national legends about mirror creatures. For example, there's an old legend in America that if a girl looks into the mirror at Halloween at midnight using only candles, she'll see the face of her future husband peering over her shoulder. There's a darker bit to this. If she's never going to marry, she sees a skeleton face instead. Now, in the marriage rooms of My Faith's temples, there are paired mirrors on either side of the altar, so that the couple who kneel at the altar can see themselves reflected into eternity. This is an evocative image and reinforces My Faith's doctrine of eternal marriage. I guess what I'm saying is mirrors have power, but there's another advantage of saying that vampires draw at least some of their power from this mirror universe, because this also explains why vampires can't cross running water easily. After all, water not only has a reflective surface, but perhaps if the vampire fell into the water, he'd be trapped in the mirror universe and possibly be destroyed or change into a new type of creature connected to water, like a banshee. Which always seem to have some things in common with vampires to me. I mean, vampires don't drink blood, I guess, but they appear at night, they bring death, they're social, it's a thought. One final thought. Do dead vampire corpses reflect? My argument is yes, they do, because that helps keep vampires a secret. If you kill a vampire and all you have is a bunch of dried bones, which are otherwise normal, the authorities stay ignorant, which is a situation I prefer. In this scene, Peter Cushing can use 2 crossed candlesticks as an improvised cross to hold back Dracula. That bugs me a little because it makes defeating a vampire way too easy. I liked it in Stephen King's Salem's Lot, where the cross doesn't always operate. In one scene, a priest pulls out his cross and the vampire just crushes it with his hand, and he says, "You have to have faith for this to work on me." In another scene from the same story, a little kid drives off a vampire with a little plastic cross-shaped gravestone in his Aurora Monster kit. Sadly, I looked up the old Aurora Monster kits. I owned several, though mine have been lost. I can't actually find one with a cross-shaped gravestone. I guess King used literary license, or I just couldn't find it. Anyway, my point is, if we assume some kind of parallel universe effect, like the vampires are following rules from somewhere else, this also helps explain their weird rules they follow. In the same way that Cthulhu himself follows natural laws from somewhere else. He can live forever, he can sleep forever, he can plastic shape, but he can only be awake when the stars are right, and he can be held off by the Elder Sign. He's not bound by our rules, but by those. So vampires, too, do not follow all of our natural laws, but they are bound by strange strictures from elsewhere. This makes them more interesting, more frightening, and more useful in our stories and games. Thank you. Remember to subscribe, click on notifications if you want them, and you can buy my stuff, at least for a while, at my website at petersengames.com. Thanks.